Hey guys, sorry the pod is late again. Last December, Riverman came out with a brand new album called Faded Recollections, and this episode is a deep dive into that album. I highly recommend that you all go give the album a listen at rivermanmusic.bandcamp.com or at youtube.com/riverman125 because it's truly an incredible experience and well worth the listen. And with that, enjoy the podcast. Welcome back to CollaboRadio, folks, for episode 7. We are so glad to have you back. We have a very special episode today. We've got Dom, known as Riverman, and we've got Milo, known as Sapien Alien. It's going to be a smaller crew of us today, but we're going to go into a nice deep dive on Riverman's new album, Faded Recollections. Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome back. So, Dom, this came out several weeks ago, I think. We just haven't had a chance to talk about it. Could you talk about a little bit of what this album is about?
Yeah, so basically for the past 4 years or so, I've been collecting 78 records, the old shellac discs from like the 50s and before.
Mm-hmm.
And I amassed a decent collection of them. And I started using them for sampling purposes. Basically, I started sampling these old records, and I started to make these like ambient sample loops using bits and pieces from these old records that I came across. And I'll just put it out there, it's very heavily inspired by The Caretaker. The Caretaker is very much the same kind of thing. He creates ambient sample loops out of old 78 records, and I essentially took the same concept and put my own spin on it. Yeah.
So we've talked about it a little bit, being vaporwave, sort of having certain similarities to this sort of niche thing.
Yeah.
And one thing I was always curious about, having heard The Caretaker, and then how you've done a couple similar releases to that, where you're saying they're loops, but it almost sounds like these very seamless, lounge kind of runs where it just goes, and it's almost like you're at some like haunted dance party in the 20s or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm like curious, like you cut that up into loops, I guess, but like how do you, like, you take like one progression of what the song was, and like how do you actually manage to, like, in a sense, arrange the tracks, because they do sound so seamless,
Well, I guess it varies from track to track. One interesting thing about sampling from all these different types of old music is that you kind of need to come up with your own unique solutions for each track and the problems that it gives you. Some of the tracks, like We Dance to Forget, for example, is very much a kind of like a static loop that wasn't that difficult to loop, I guess, because it has a very kind of like bouncy, easy to follow rhythm to it.
Yeah.
So it means that you can cut it on the beat very easily.
Yeah.
But with some of the others, it was definitely trickier.
Like all those couple choral moments, I guess.
Yeah. And some of them are literally just like full, not really cut at all tracks. So I guess All Washed Up would be an example of that. That is literally just a full side of a record, just kind of like played out with various effects and stuff on it.
I actually thought that All Washed Up and We Dance to Forget seemed like sort of like sibling tracks, sort of continuations of one another, and I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, that was definitely put in mind, having We Dance to Forget near the beginning and then All Washed Up near the end. That was
awesome. I thought it was cool, and I was like, I bet he planned that.
Well, again, The Caretaker did a similar thing on An Empty Bliss Beyond This World, his most popular album. The album starts out with these kind of like bouncy ballroom dance tracks, and then in the middle it gets kind of dark and weird and messed up, and then it kind of comes back to the ballroom dance again at the end. And yeah, I definitely borrowed that idea from him.
Nice.
It's not quite. There's differences, obviously, but yeah. Again, that was his idea, I guess, not mine.
Nice. I mean, it works. It works.
Cool.
I'm glad you did it. So, did we want to go through each of the tracks and then just kind of? I know you've mentioned a couple of these already, but I mean from the beginning and then just kind of working our way through the album.
Yeah. I
Cool,
mean,
cool.
there's more just stuff to talk about in the tracks I've mentioned. Anyway,
Totally.
So it's fine. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess starting from the very beginning on the title track, "Faded Recollections," I listened to this album again last night, and there are these pauses and stops in the melody, which are kind of they're a little off-putting in that it's almost like you're forgetting what you're saying mid-sentence, and then you kind of remember, and then you forget it again. And this album it's kind of uncanny valley in that it is, for me, it's calming, but it's also really off-putting. You know.
That's interesting praise.
Like I don't know how else to describe it. Like it is calming, but there's a sense of foreboding with it as well. It's a really unique blend of emotion.
Yeah. So that first track was actually the very last track I made
No
for
shit.
the album. I made it literally like 2 weeks before the album came out. Basically, like I started to put the tracks in a certain order, and I realized that there was no track on the album that was a very strong opening track. So I was like, right, so I need to make an opening track now. And fortunately, there was another track that was very similar to All Washed Up in that it was a full kind of like ballroom dance track with effects on it. And I decided I didn't want to put it on the album because I just felt like it was a kind of like weaker variation of this All Washed Up track. So I didn't bother with it. But when it came to making an intro track, I was like, well, I don't have any more samples to choose from because I've used them all. But there is this one sample here that I've worked with, but I didn't like my initial results with it. So I kind of took it on a much more different approach with the second time around, where it's instead of just being a full run through, it's like a single small section of this track that I sampled and chopped and screwed in a really kind of like bizarre way.
Nice.
So there's actually like a couple layers of the same sample going on within it. There's the vocal kind of lines in there that are constantly like cutting out and coming back at various points.
Yeah.
And I created that literally just by laying the sample out in full and then cutting out the bits I didn't want. So yeah, if any particular like lyric in the song kind of like grabbed me and thought, oh, that would sound cool in this track, I just kind of cut that out and then left it there and deleted everything else around it. So that's why it has this kind of like stop start kind of vibe to it.
Yeah. Nice.
And the other layer is really kind of weird in that it's not quite it's the same sample, but I've rearranged it a little bit, and I've also applied a noise gate to it, a very hard noise gate to it, so that the audio only comes through when it's really at a particularly like loud point in the song. So it has this kind of like really kind of like jittery, glitchy, grainy effect, and on top of that as well, I also kind of did some beat swapping to effects to it as well. So it has this kind of like almost just like really just real trippy kind of messed up lo-fi effect thing going on with it.
Yeah, it's definitely a neat effect. It's very, very unique though. I mean, you shared some of Caretaker's work with me before, but that aside, I don't think I've heard anything quite like this before.
Yeah, that one's definitely one of the more original tracks on the album for sure. I've never quite heard him do something quite like that track.
Yeah, I listened to it a little bit earlier today, and I was I was driving, so I guess the different contexts, yields different results. But when it started, I was pretty taken back at how strong it comes out, because it's got those effects are very effective, and there's a power, I guess, to the way that the samples, like this caretaker style, is like works on the sort of psyche of the listener.
Yeah.
And I was really taken back by the fact that it sounds very reminiscent of this one band that I like. They're called KO Dot, and they have this one album called
Oh yes.
Yeah,
I've heard of them.
Coffins on IO is this one album, and the opening track is very good, and I think a lot of it has to do with the opening, which feels very similar to this, where it's like I don't know, it there's this weird lo-fi sort of, it's hard to describe because it feels sort of textural, but it's like but it's actually producing a musicality beyond just like sort of an environment. And they feel very comparable, where you like hear it and then it just immediately gets you going in just the right way. And I was kind of taken back, like realizing like, well, shit, this is like really, it's literally like you're, like if you want to think of the album taking you on a journey, it's like, it's just this like this little push that in comparison seems like it's really momentous as in like it's a good moment, but it's also like momentum, like pushing you forward, but then all of a sudden you're just coasting.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was a really interesting juxtaposition where you start out sort of with a bang,
nice,
and then you're coasting very nicely.
That was definitely the intention. Like I said, when I first put the album together and sequenced it, there was no track that really gave it that nice, like just perfect start.
Yeah, the opening.
Right, I need to make that now.
That first impression.
I need to make that first track now, and make sure that the album starts off strong instead of just kind of like dropping you straight into it, which is what it would have been before.
Yeah, have it actually try to reflect appropriately what everything else is going to be.
Yeah,
and it's I think it's a real accomplishment considering it's ambient music, and it's like, I think one of the hardest sort of things you got to do, where this album's going to be meditative, but you have to come out really hooking the listener, and it's hard to do that when by definition ambience sort of supposed to like lull you into not trying to just blend with your environment, where it's not really hooking you. Like ambient is the antithesis literally of hooking.
Yeah,
but you do have to have some kind of hook at the beginning, like I guess in any kind of music, like obviously you're releasing this to like be considered by people, you want them to listen to it, but you do have to hook them. Like any kind of music stuff, we are in a sense like fishing for listeners. You got to have kind of hooks to try to get people reeled in. And I think that was like the most subtle, like paradoxical kind of thing, which is also making it feel very interesting because, so much of the album is like Jack said, it's like, it's mellow, but like you have this funny eeriness to it as well. That really, I think, is like a great interplay of like emotions.
Nice.
Yeah. Very well said, Milo.
I guess this is why I'm here, this ambient shit.
This is absolutely why we have you here.
This is exactly why I wanted Milo in this podcast.
Put a lot of thought into it.
I'm so glad that this worked out to have you here again, because you have such an incredible insight into these things. So when it comes to We Dance to Forget, I believe, was this one on your SoundCloud at any point, Dom?
Yes, this is one of the, I guess, earlier tracks that I made. I made it back in 2015, I think.
Damn.
Yeah.
Alright. Yeah.
And I remember being particularly happy with this one. I think it was the first track I really kind of like nailed this genre down like properly. And I uploaded it to the SoundCloud page, and to my surprise, it did quite well. A lot of people liked it, which I thought was interesting because it's kind of a niche thing. But yeah, this track may sound straightforward, like it is literally just a loop of like a piano solo in a old ballroom jazz song. I believe it's Victor Sylvester, actually, if anyone knows who that is.
Ooh. I don't know who that is, but carry on.
He was like one of the big ballroom jazz guys of the 30s, but never mind. Yeah, so yeah, it is literally just a loop that plays over and over again. It's a fairly long loop as well, so I get some mileage out of it. One thing that I learned when doing this stuff is that you can't just loop a sample, pitch it down a couple semitones and slap some reverb on it and expect it to sound good. You need to do other things to it in order to get the most out of it. So one production experiment I did, particularly with this track, was I created multiple copies of the same sample and layered them on top of each other, and I worked with different EQ bands for each sample, and then compressed them and affected them differently from one another. So,
And that gave it some real depth then, I'll bet.
yes, definitely.
Nice.
So like the mids, I guess the most straightforward part, and then it's literally just the reverb effect on it. And then there's the low frequencies, which is definitely the most difficult part to work with. And with that, I put a really, really tight low pass filter on it, so you can only hear the bass line on the low frequency
Nice.
band, and no reverb at all on that, because I found that when you do just work with a single layer and you just slap reverb on everything, the bass line sounds like garbage. It really does, because it just completely like muddies it up and gives it no like oomph or presence to it at all. And so there's no reverb on the bass, and most importantly, I boosted the bass quite significantly, so it has a real kind of like boominess to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. It was very effective.
Yeah, and because the bass line is like has a very simple rhythm to it, it is literally like almost a kick drum kind of like rhythm. I used it to sidechain compression. I used it as I sidechained it to the high frequencies, which is literally just like the crackle from the record. And I created a kind of subtle sidechain effect where every time the bass comes into the track, the high end of the track dips a little bit. So it has this, it gives us this kind of like weird, almost psychedelic rhythm of effects to it, which I thought came out pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of going back to the bass line a little bit, there was a couple of times while I was listening to it, I had my phone turned off so that I could have an uninterrupted experience while listening to the album. But there's a part of the bass line that I swear to God sounds exactly like my phone when it vibrates, and that freaked me out.
Well, that wasn't intentional, but
Apparently, vibration, like when a phone vibrates, there's a tone to it. It's B flat apparently. So
No shit.
If there was a
Okay.
B flat in the bass line, I guess that was it.
Weird. But yeah, that was actually one of the things I wrote down. I was like, there's a part of the bass line that sounds just like my phone, and it's freaking me out. But yeah, this piece, it seems like gently nostalgic, and yet it reminded me of like the end of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining.
Yes.
I was going to mention that.
Yeah, so if you don't know, The Caretaker originally was inspired by The Shining.
No
That's
shit.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
That's where his name comes from, The Caretaker. You've
Oh.
always been The Caretaker.
Oh my God.
Everybody watch The Shining by Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah, I got to watch
Yeah,
that again.
fuck.
I love
So,
it.
yeah, the very last shot in that film is that close-up of Jack Nicholson in that old photo, and there's some like very reverby ballroom jazz playing in the background.
Wow.
It's all forgotten now, or whatever it is. I think it's that song. Yeah, that's where he got the idea from originally.
Nice. Okay, that's
Mine's
cool.
officially blown.
I was like, I don't know why it's reminding me of this. And
Yeah,
now
yeah.
it's like that all came together. Wow.
Yeah. I wanted to say all those things, how like you think about that movie and how there's like, it's considered a great horror classic. And I wanted to say how like a lot of these sounds, it's almost off-putting. Like it's almost difficult to try to listen to willingly because there's such a eeriness to it. And it makes so much sense if you compare that to the feeling of The Shining. And then of course the end, I was
Yeah.
going to say, he's like, the way The Shining ends is this weird like mind fuck of like thinking, why the fuck is Jack in a photo of a New Year's Eve celebration from like the 20s?
Yeah,
Like
Yeah.
there's no reasonable explanation, and there's a sort of horror to it and a weird eeriness because there's of course the haunting of this resort, and then you just think like that's the kicker of the movie, where you're just sitting there thinking about what the fuck does this freaky 20s ballroom like jazzy cabaret thing have to do with this haunting thing. And they get meshed together, this idea of like this haunting thing and this old-fashioned kind of like celebratory event, and it makes for like the weirdest feeling, which is why it works so well. And now it makes sense why The Caretaker is able to make this very simple processing of these sort of things and make it work. Maybe that's a very interesting thought to think, like, if none of us had like seen The Shining, like maybe because we've seen The Shining, that's like the seed that makes us all feel why this sort of approach works.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be very curious to think, like, if somebody hadn't ever heard The Caretaker and never seen The Shining and then was shown, say, this album and try to make sense of it, if they would have that same kind of mental recognition, as it were.
Ooh.
that is an interesting thought. Yeah.
If any of you out there still haven't seen The Shining, maybe just for kicks and giggles, try giving this album a listen first and then see The Shining and see what you think of it.
Yeah, hopefully
Yeah.
me talking about it didn't like sort of ruin some of the blow that the movie would have.
Well,
Well, too late.
yeah, whatever.
Spoilers.
Yeah, but yeah, for the next track, could you tell us a little bit more about Centuries Have Passed Us By?
Yeah. So one thing that I definitely did differently to The Caretaker was I sampled these old church choir 78s from like the 20s and 30s, and I basically I just got a hold of like a bunch of them one time, and I was like, okay, cool, this is different, but how am I going to be able to use these? Because it's not nearly the same kind of music as Victor Sylvester and all that kind of stuff. So I just kind of like played them, and I was like, okay, because there's nothing particularly interesting about them at all. It is literally just really old church choir recordings of like popular like Christian hymns and things like that. And I thought, you know what, let's just record it and do my general effects that I do on these kind of tracks, reverb, etc., to them, just see what they sound like. So I tried it and I listened to it and I thought, yeah, it sounds cool with the reverb. It definitely like adds some depth to it, but the actual music itself is very dull. It's not that interesting because most people have heard these old Christian songs before, and they're kind of, I guess, mundane sounding. So, not to shit on those songs or anything.
No, it's true.
They suck. It's boring church music.
So then I thought, you know what? Let's just mess around with it a bit more, and I decided to hit reverse on this particular one that I was working on at the time, and it created a completely different song. Like, I couldn't believe that all I had done was hit the reverse button, and this whole other song, which was way better than the song that was forwards, came out of it.
That's amazing. Yeah. Holy shit. But yeah, this track really it brought a vivid image to mind of like someone walking into the sanctuary of an abandoned church and just hearing the ethereal echoes of the choir from days long past just still reverberating around the room. And
yeah, that's definitely the imagery that came to my mind as well. It gives you a kind of like old world, like medieval buildings, kind of like dark, ghostly kind of vision.
Very cool. Shall we move on to the next track?
Yeah.
All right. Ooh, a two-parter.
Yes. So the reason why these next two tracks are, I guess, brother and sister tracks, is that they're both from the same artist, the samples.
Oh, okay.
They're both from one of the old great jazz pianists, Jelly Roll Morton, from the 30s.
Link in the description below.
And these two actually weren't sampled from 78s. They were sampled from a vinyl compilation of old 78 recordings, which is why they have a slightly different, I guess, like texture to them. They're not the crackle is not quite as intensely noisy as some of the other tracks, and I think the actual like music itself is a lot louder and clearer on those, and that's the reason why.
Yeah.
And there's not a whole lot to say about these tracks. They are literally just like piano loops.
Hey, that's real. That's valid.
Yeah.
This reminded me a lot of. I don't know if either of you have played BioShock before, but it reminded me a lot of the music that you would hear on the radios in the taverns of Rapture. And
funnily enough, one of my other friends said that to me as well.
Oh, so. Shit.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's not just me. Cool, but yeah, like I'm picturing like a lone figure at the end of a bar with like the other patrons like keeping their distance from this guy because they know he's troubled or what have you. And then like when part 2 kicked in, I was like, oh, those drinks have hit him now. His painful memories are slipping away, but so is his grasp on reality. And then like I'm thinking like suddenly everyone's gone, like including the barkeep, and he's just trying to like remember who he is and how he got here.
Wow, that's an interesting take.
Yeah.
I never quite thought of it that way.
I did this. It was a very late night listen, so I was kind of sleepy. But I was just like I had Notepad open and I was just writing down these images and thoughts as they came to me with each of the tracks. But yeah, the next track, Gathering, to me, it sort of it rode the line between wedding and funeral. And I kept going back and forth on which one it was going to be, and it was really unsettling.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite track. Probably it had a very big impact on me. I had a similar reaction where it was like this very wide range, like a funeral and a wedding. I think that was a very good way of putting it.
Thanks.
Yeah, so this is actually the very first track I made for this album.
Holy shit.
I made it in 2014, so a long time ago. I remember this record that I sampled for this one was one of the very first 78s I ever got, which is, I guess, is why it's one of the first I made. And it's a bit of, I guess, an odd one out in that instead of the sample being from the 20s and 30s, it's from the 1950s.
Whoa.
And it's actually of a fairly well-known song. Not well-known from our like generation standpoint, but from like, you know, our like grandparents and stuff. This guy called David Whitfield had a hit single in 1954 with a song called Cara Mia, and it's a fairly common 78's go as well. But I had this one copy of it, and it was actually hideously warped, this copy. I could like barely play it, but I managed to get through the entire A side of the record without it fucking up, so I was very glad of that. But
Nice.
Yeah, so one interesting thing about this track is if you listen to the original song, it's this really kind of like horribly like overly dramatic like opera pop song. Like it's really quite awful to be honest. The vocals in the track and the strings in the track are really quite nice, but then the singer comes in and he's got this like really like over the top like opera voice, and it just puts me off the way.
Like you feel like it's like not a, you feel like it was a quote unquote opera voice that he just decided to put on for the track.
No, I think that's just the way he sang, but like it just doesn't suit the instrumentation in my opinion at all.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think that was a big thing back sort of, I suppose, 50s, because like pop music had only just sort of started to become a thing.
Yeah.
Yet people were still very much in that vein of like classical training, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like, I guess he wanted to be pop, but he was trained operatically, and it's by the 60s everybody realized like, don't mix those two things. So I guess we have this unfortunate like patch in the 50s where like people are doing shit like that.
Yeah. But yeah, like obviously it worked because I'm pretty sure it was a #1 single when it came out.
Shit.
So yeah. The song is pretty terrible, but what I did was I recorded the record at 45 instead of 78 RPM, which is what gives it really like kind of like slow, moody kind of vibe. Mm-hmm. If you listen to the original, it's just a completely different sound altogether. It's just crazy how much just a simple change of the speed on the turntable makes it sound different.
Yeah.
The vocals are like almost mournful sounding at 45 RPM. Whereas at 78 in the original speed, they're kind of more ethereal, I guess. And yeah, I think the strings in particular sound a lot nicer at 45 RPM. They have this kind of like richness to them, which they don't have in the original. And yeah, of course, on top of that, there's reverb to give it some extra depth, and just like general layering of like the crackle and controlling that a little bit so that it's not too much and not too little. You know what I mean? I've had to do that with a lot of the tracks where I've digitally removed crackle but then applied crackle again to kind of like fill in that sonic gap.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because some of these old recordings are really like hideously like beat up and almost unplayable because of how the age that they are. So you have to learn some digital audio editing that's pretty intense in order to get the best out of these old recordings.
Gotcha. Yeah, it still held that same aesthetic. So you did a good job with choosing your places for those crackles.
Yeah. Also, I should point out that at no point the opera voice appears in my version. I deliberately cut around it because, unsurprisingly, it sounds even worse slowed down.
Amazing. So while gathering was like, I couldn't decide whether it was a funeral or a wedding. I feel like Are They in Heaven Now? Definitely. I was like, yeah, this is a requiem. Who died? Was it natural causes? And then like there were these like noises near the end, and I was like, what are those? Are those like the footsteps of like the Grim Reaper walking away, having done his job?
Wow, you've really put like a kind of like story into this. I was not
Yeah.
expecting this at all.
It's what happens in my mind.
Well, it's definitely interesting to hear. I'll definitely think differently next time I listen to it. Yeah, this track, again, it's very similar to Centuries Have Passed Us By. In fact, I think it's from the flip side of the same record, if I remember correctly. Yeah, that record was particularly generous for whatever reason. Because, like, you know, I bought loads of these Church Choir 78s, and the vast majority of them, when I hit reverse on them, they just sounded like crap, as you'd expect. But there was the odd one, like this one, where you hit it in reverse, and it somehow just comes together for whatever inexplicable reason.
Yeah.
And yeah, very stylistically similar to Centuries Have Passed Us By, but musically maybe a little less intense, I guess. I've used slightly different reverb on that track, and the crackle is a bit less in your face as well, I think. So yes, they are very similar, but production wise a bit different.
Nice.
So, well, how common is that I suppose would be reflective of like a sort of mastery of this style, where like you're going through each track and you don't just take like the same sort of blueprint on each one, like you're doing a different kind of crackle and a different style of reverb to make sure that each thing has its own unique colors or whatnot.
Yeah, I think part of it is down to the fact that I made these tracks at such a kind of like different points in time. So, you know, there are literal years between the makings of some of these tracks. So like, you know, I'd make one track, and then over time my production style, my production ideas would change. So that would naturally be brought on to the new tracks I'd be making at that time. Mm-hmm. So that's why Gathering sounds a certain way, because that was the way I was producing stuff in 2014. And, you know, Faded Recollections, the title track, sounds completely different because that's a much more recent one. So yeah, it's interesting because I think because I've made these tracks so wide apart, they all kind of naturally have a different aesthetic to them just because of that.
Nice.
Just because of how my style has progressed.
Nice. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense considering you started production, you said in 2014?
Yes.
Yeah, shit. So 4 years of just working on this album on and off. I mean, I imagine the production and the sound would change from track to track that way.
Yeah.
But I think it's still, even despite those production differences, it comes together very nicely. It still paints a whole picture.
I mean, I had obviously had to go back to these tracks when I was finished making them all to make sure that they weren't incredibly different, you know, that I mastered them in the same way and I fixed any kind of like past mixing errors or things like that, you know. So they all got like, at the end of the project, they all got a good, thorough finishing job. That was all done at the same time, which is why I guess it works that way.
Yeah, job well done. Can you tell us a little more about Like Rain?
Yes. Again, Like Rain was one of the earliest ones. I think that one was also 2014.
Nice.
And this one is one of the more intensely edited ones, I suppose. It's actually an old kind of like a military band, like a military brass band record from the 30s.
Interesting.
Yeah, so not something you'd expect to get any kind of useful samples out of at all. But again, I played it at 45 RPM and I reversed it. So not only is it at a different speed, it's also backwards. And I buried the kind of like the brass instrumentation under a ton of crackle effects. So it's probably the most intense track in terms of layering, maybe, just because of how much crackle is going on and things like that.
Yeah, holy shit! I would not have guessed military brass band when I heard this.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely the most heavily edited one.
Yeah,
it sounds absolutely nothing like the source material at all.
Wow, yeah. When I heard this, it felt very premonition-like. I wrote what I wrote down for this one was, it's almost like walking onto the scene of a gruesome murder and finding the killer kneeling in prayer over the bodies of his victims. I also wrote down like Uncanny Valley, the track. Yeah, this one also really messed with my emotions. I'm like, what am I feeling right now?
Yeah, again, this one was the one interesting thing that kind of grabbed me about the source material as well, is that they had it's like a church bell in the recording, and when you reverse it in particular, I think that part was the part that sounded the most eerie, just this kind of like reversed church bell ringing in the track. And yeah, I guess that was the reason why I sampled it and tried to work with it in the first place, because I liked the bell sound in this sample, and not necessarily the rest of it. And I thought maybe I can kind of cut that church bell out and use it for something. But in the end, it turned out that the other instrumentation, the brass instrumentation, actually turned out quite nice as well. So
nice.
Yeah. And it's called Like Rain for, I guess, an obvious reason. The intense crackling, it reminded me of like rain.
Yeah, absolutely. So about this next track, The Last Will and Testament of Captain Hunter, who is Captain Hunter?
Yes. Yeah, so this track, the name behind it has a story to it. In the summer, I visited a very small, quaint village in the Peak District called Yulgrieve, and it's a very nice place, but it has this church, this old like medieval church right in the middle of it, and there's a churchyard in there full of these really old graves from like the 1700s and 1800s and things like that. And there was this one gravestone that really caught my eye while I was there, just because of what was written on it. And I've actually found a website that lists all the gravestones in this particular churchyard, and I was able to find the inscription on this gravestone on this site, so I'll just read it to you. The grave is for a Sarah Rutherford, who died on the 9th of February 1861, and the grave was erected at the desire of her sixth son, Captain Abram Augustus Hunter of the 23rd Regiment of Ohio Volunteers, as expressed in his last will and testament. He was killed by a bullet through the chest on the 9th of May 1864, in the hour of victory in the Battle of Cloyd Mountain, Western Virginia, under General Crook, aged 35. And I just thought that was such a crazy thing to read on a gravestone in the Peak District. It's like some guy who died in America is written on a gravestone in this place in the middle of nowhere. And yeah, I just like, for whatever reason, I just remembered that. And when it came to naming this particular track, I thought, for some reason it reminds me of like a funeral or like a graveyard, and it's very mournful and slow, but it has
I thought when I was listening to it, I was wondering about like who Captain Hunter was and what kind of life they led. Like, were they well liked, were they loathed, and I was like, are they on their deathbed, or are they merely putting their affairs in order in case they meet an early end?
And you know, if you read between the lines of that story, it's very, very sad. This guy who died in battle, in his last will and testament, wanted this gravestone for his mum, who had died a few years before. And I just thought it kind of like fit, really. It's obviously the title of it is different to the others because it has a real world context to it of sorts.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to make a reference to it because I just thought it was really interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of fit the, I guess, spooky vibe of it.
Absolutely. I'm glad you did that. And then, with Sadness Yet to Pass, I felt like if Captain Hunter wasn't gone in the last track, he certainly was now. I got a real sense of mourning from this one.
Yes. So the thing that this track reminded me of very intensely was like ghosts and kind of like unseen, sad, mournful like spirits in like a really kind of like old church or stone building or something. I don't know why, that was just a very vivid image in my mind when I was making this track. You get the impression that the kind of like the vocals in this one, which is again is a church choir, but for whatever reason this one is texturally quite different to the other two. It's much more kind of ethereal, I guess.
Yeah.
And there's just this like crazy, like awful, like sadness to these vocals that at least I hear, particularly when there's just that one vocal that comes in to do just like a kind of like solo on her own. I'm presuming it's a woman. That part in particular spoke to me. I honestly think this is one of my favourite tracks on the album just because of how affecting it was to me personally.
Yeah.
And again, that is it's a reversed sample. It sounded a lot less interesting forwards than it did backwards, which is interesting.
Funny how that works.
Yeah.
The note I wrote for this one was brief, but I said that in addition to the general sense of mourning that I got from this track, the crackles kind of reminded me of tears hitting a tabletop, as if someone had just received news of their loved one's passing and they're kind of going through the initial shock and mourning of it all. And then with the next track, From Time to Eternity, it feels like some time has passed. And it feels like someone is kind of visiting the grave of their loved one, perhaps several years after their demise. And it's loving and nostalgic and sad. And, I'm sorry, I should have had you say your thoughts on the track first before I went rambling on. What were your thoughts?
So this track is by far got the shortest loop on the entire album. And again, I feel like this one in particular is very Caretaker-esque, and that's mainly because I sampled an artist that he himself has sampled many times. What were their names? There was these two African-American singers in the late 20s called Leighton and Johnstone, who were one of the first African-American groups to become popular with white audiences, which I think is an interesting piece of history.
Oh, yeah.
And they did these kind of like upbeat, traditional pop songs, but they also kind of have these mournful, like piano ballads as well. And they have little like piano openings to their songs are perfect for this kind of music.
Nice.
And this particular one was a loop of the intro of one of their songs. It just has this kind of like, sadness to it.
Yeah.
The crackle is very intense in this one. I actually had a bit of trouble trying to tame the crackle in this one because the record was just so dirty and it overpowered the kind of quiet piano a lot. But I think in the end it came out okay.
Yeah, I dare say it did.
And the title From Time to Eternity is yet again a reference to a gravestone that I saw in this place. I've got it here. John Ely, he was the nephew of the late Major Ely. He experienced that awful change from time to eternity. 27th of July, 1805, age 44.
Holy shit.
Yeah, how cool is that?
Yeah.
I had to use that. From time to eternity.
Yeah.
What does that mean in the context, though?
I'm presuming it means passing on from life to death, eternity being like whatever it is after death, and time being time we're alive. That's at least what I interpreted it as.
Yeah.
Yeah, all these old gravestones just have these really kind of like creepy, almost like poetic statements on them and things like that. And
Yeah.
it's good for inspiration for like track titles and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was gonna say like these track titles are they feel very very good.
Absolutely, I agree. Moving on, could you tell us a little bit about I Found Comfort in the Quiet Darkness?
Yes. So again, this was another church choir sample, but again, this one's treated quite a bit differently to the others. I really upped the compression on this one, so it's super loud, and the organ in this recording, for whatever reason, is way louder and way closer to whatever they were recording it with than the others. So I was really able to kind of like bass boost the hell out of it and just create this kind of like awesome wall of sound using just this bassy organ and these church choir vocals.
Nice.
Again, it's reversed, but it's a much shorter loop than the others, and I kind of like I keep the loop compacted first, and then I kind of let it run for a little bit, and it kind of goes a little crazy and weird at one point, but then I bring it back again, which I think came out kind of interesting.
Yeah. What I wrote down for this one was that we're back in the abandoned church, and our intruder has made friends with the ghosts of the choir. That's what came to mind for me.
Sounds like a sitcom spin-off or something.
Yeah. Totally. Moving on, I know we already talked about All Washed Up and how it's like a sibling track to We Dance to Forget, but did you post an excerpt of this on SoundCloud as well? Because it sounds super fucking familiar.
I didn't, but I did post an earlier version of it on YoungCloud when YoungCloud existed.
Oh, R.I.P. YoungCloud.
Yes, RIP. Basically, it's from the same kind of old record, these old 30s dance hall tracks, and like I said before, it is a full uncut recording of one of these tracks, but it's been pitched down a little bit, and again I've intensely layered it much similarly to We Dance to Forget, so
Nice.
The bass is really loud and boomy, the mids are really reverby, but what's different is I've used one of the layers, and I've applied a constantly shifting low pass filter on it, which is climbing up and down through the mid frequencies every few seconds.
Ooh.
And what happens is, because I've already got a reverbed out mid frequency section in there, when the mids are taken out by this low pass filter, the reverbed layer underneath it is still there, so you can still hear the mid frequencies, but they're a lot wetter and distant sounding.
Oh, sure.
So, and then when the low pass goes back up again and you can hear the mids again, the much more clear, unaffected layer comes through. So you've got this constantly like shifting battle between reverb and this kind of like dry, unreverbed layer, which is coming back and forth at several intervals. And I guess the reason why I call it All Washed Up is because the low pass filter on it kind of gives it this weird, almost washy filter effect to it. Yeah.
It's a very interesting technique. You might have to steal that.
Yeah.
It's all just part of the like experimentation of this album. I didn't want to just do the same things for each track, because I thought not only would that be boring for people to listen to, but it would be boring for me to make as well.
Word.
So yeah, I just wanted to have some fun with it and do some really wacky things, and naturally some of the wacky things you do sound like crap, but occasionally you do one wacky thing and it works, and you just roll with it. And that was one instance of that.
Well done. So, can you tell us a little bit about the closing track, Returning?
Yeah. I'd say this is probably the most simple track on the album. It is a very straightforward piano loop from an old Fats Waller song.
Nice.
Fats Waller was one of the big jazz pianists and songwriters of the 20s and 30s. He wrote Ain't Misbehavin', which is a pretty famous song.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, this particular one, I liked the piano in it, so I just threw some reverb on it. Again, this is a vinyl recording, not a 78 recording, so it sounds a little different.
Yeah.
And, you know, I thought, when I first made it, I thought, yeah, it sounds nice, but the loop itself doesn't carry the whole track on its own. I need to do something more with it. So halfway through, I reverse it, and again, just the simple reverse of this sample completely changes it and makes it just sound way different. And I thought the effect it created was a really nice outro, and I remember when I first made the track that it would be a perfect closing track for the album.
Yeah, I agree. About this track, I don't know why, because it's by far the happiest sounding track on this album, but it immediately brought me to tears when I was listening to it last night. I don't know why, but it did that. And I even wrote down in my notes, I wrote, why am I crying?
Wow, I didn't realise this album was going to cause so much emotional stress.
Hey, no. When music moves you, that's always a good thing. I would much rather listen to music that makes me go through things rather than just blah, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely what I listen to music for. I want to be emotionally affected in some way and feel something from it. I don't necessarily... Well, I mean, obviously I listen to music to have fun and relax and all that.
Well, of course.
But, my most favourite thing to listen to music for is the emotional side of it. So I guess that naturally comes through on the stuff I make as well. I want to make emotionally affecting music.
Well, I dare say you've accomplished that, so well done.
Thanks.
Yeah, man.
I did have a thing that I felt like was worth mentioning. It was way back in the beginning, though. Well, it was about, like, I don't know if you'll use this, but I'll at least say what I was thinking, which was, like, you had the thought of, like, how there was, like, the little gaps and how it was sort of eerie in the samples. And I felt like it was interesting and reflecting on the sort of ghostly quality to the music, because, like, I almost wanted to compare it to, like, a very old person whose kind of faculties are slipping.
Yes.
And they sort of like have glitches in their cognitive abilities or something, or like their memory, where like they're sitting there thinking, and they're having these memories of like their youth, or something, and then all of a sudden their brain just shuts off.
Yeah.
And then it snaps back on or something, and it's like this. It's almost horrifying to think like how there can be this presence of life, like you're feeling the way that this was for this person, and then all of a sudden just nothing.
Yes.
For like a split second, and then right back into it.
Yeah. So it's really funny you should say that, Milo, because when I listened to the album for the first time a couple of weeks ago, I was talking with Dom, and I said that, yeah, the album reminded me of someone who has dementia or who's suffered a stroke, who's just trying to recall these distant memories and just kind of just grasping at straws and can't quite figure it out with full clarity. And just, wow, that was really cool just to hear that same thread of thought coming from someone else,
Yeah, it's a funny thought, thinking like we had all these overlaps, having the connections to The Shining, but to also have this is like I guess a funny thought of like this music hits on like such a human level, and really, like I've said it a bunch of times to you guys, where it's like it hits you right in the feels.
Yeah.
Like it really speaks to just life in general. So like I guess almost anybody could really have the same kind of thought process when they listen to something like this.
It's interesting that you guys brought that up, because that's actually one of the concepts behind the Caretaker's music, is that it represents the mind of someone with dementia, with those kinds of problems.
Holy shit.
And that's actually, with his most recent work, what he's been going down the most concept wise. So he's been putting out these string of albums that are all connected, and they're supposed to represent different stages of dementia, and they get more and more fucked up as they go along. So yeah, I think that's just like it's just something that naturally comes from this kind of music almost.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's almost a shame, because if he's like making a conscious effort to like be reflective of that kind of direction, I thought it was like you'd almost assume he'd be like, well, let me make an album that can like help people with dementia. But then like you said, how he like gets it more fucked up, like what that would do to somebody with dementia.
Yeah, like honestly, it is
Like kill him.
The stuff, this most recent stuff he's been making is just on another level of like terrifying. Like the stuff like what I'm doing here, he's kind of moved on from that now, and so like stage 1 of this series is very much this kind of style, and then stage 2, he really starts to kind of like warp the samples in really bizarre and uncomfortable ways. And by like stage 4 and 5, it's like barely music anymore.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was only about a year ago that I had listened to The Caretaker, and it was funny how like the more I kept like processing the effects of the music, the more I was like, this should be a horror soundtrack, because it's like really he's like very good at making it very off-putting.
Yeah.
And that was one of the biggest things that I wanted to say about this album, is that it's like there's sad reflective moments, but not in such a horrifying way. There's a lot of like humanity in this compared to that.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
There's a much better, more realistic range of emotions.
Yeah. That's the main thing I guess I wanted to do, because I didn't want to just outright copy The Caretaker and just, make an album that sounded exactly like something he would do. I wanted to put my own spin on it and make a kind of like broader set of styles and put a broader set of emotions in it that weren't just about like memory loss and things, but also encompassed other things like mournfulness and sadness and loneliness and all those kinds of things. And again, I think I focused more than The Caretaker does on trying to make the music pretty and like, I don't want to say beautiful because that sounds a bit obnoxious, but like just
too late. We get the point. I mean, it's like sort of joyous, I suppose.
Yeah.
Word. All right, gents. I actually do have to get going in the next couple of minutes, but before I do, Dom, congratulations. You have accomplished every single one of those goals that you established earlier for this album.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, of course. Because I certainly went on an emotional journey. But where can people get this album?
They can get it on my Bandcamp page. It's rivermanmusic.bandcamp.com, and it's currently the top result because it's my most recent album.
Excellent. And of course, we'll have a link for that in the description down below.
You can also listen to the full album on my YouTube channel, which is Riverman125.
Excellent. And Milo, where can people find your stuff?
On Google.
Okay, I'll
Just
find a
Google
link and
that
put
shit.
it in.
I don't have the things. This happened last time.
Right.
I don't know my name things. If you just look it up, it'll be on one of the standard websites.
Yeah. We'll find the link and I'll put it in the description below for sure. You can find my stuff at soundcloud.com/Jawka or youtube.com/JawkaJabberwock. And Thank you guys so much for coming together for this wonderful deep dive into Faded Recollections. This was an absolutely fantastic discussion, and I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys on the next pod.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I am rolling in that outro music.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.